Hey, David, can you hear me?
Yeah, what's up, Andre? How's it going?
What's up? Very good. So we're going to start in a couple of minutes, then we'll
Okay.
have more people joining. But I'm glad to see you. How are you feeling?
Yeah, I'm good, man. How are you?
I'm very good. I'm very good. Excited with this conversation. I'm looking forward to see how it goes.
You said David comes here to reveal all about Twitter and Elon Musk,
No, no,
right?
no.
That's how you got people to sign up.
We'll see. We'll see what happens. I'm very curious. Like my questions don't focus on
Uh,
that, but I can't control where the conversation goes. So I'll do my best, but I'm more interested on the product knowledge you carry, which is a lot. So
for sure.
though look, of course, there's a hot topic, right? And even I'm curious, but I'm more curious about the stuff you know that we shared already. So I already know a lot of the stuff you know, which is why I'm really curious about this conversation.
Sounds good.
Meanwhile, we have people joining in the next couple of minutes. Just gonna post something and we'll be back. By the way, you're in Barcelona, right?
Yeah, at the moment, yeah.
You're staying for a bit more time than you fly to the US, right?
I'm mostly here right now.
Mostly
Yeah,
there.
I'm
Okay.
occasionally in New York and New England, but yeah, mostly in Barcelona.
All right. So even having the power of choice and being anywhere you want right now, you still choose Barcelona. That says a lot about the city.
Or it says a lot about the US.
Or it says a lot about the US. That's actually a great point. That is actually a really good point.
But no, it's nice here. It's been really nice here.
No, it is an amazing city. It is amazing. You should spend some time in Lisbon. If you have flexibility, I'll host you, and I think we could do some really cool stuff.
Are
Okay,
most folks from 1 Month PM based in Lisbon, Europe? Where's everyone?
Across the world, we have
Okay.
people. I was commenting a couple of days ago. I at channel on our general, and it said, "Be careful. There's 18 time zones."
Mm.
So I mean, that's insane. I don't know how far 18 time zones go, but that's pretty far. So, and this program has people from across Europe mostly because of time zones.
Mhm.
But yeah, across multiple countries. I'm
Awesome.
looking forward for this. Okay, so for sake of time, also because I know you're a super busy person, we're gonna get started. I know more people are gonna be joining in the meanwhile. We generally get 20, 25 people joining these conversations. We're recording, by the way, to share internally only. So we share with
Okay.
participants that couldn't join over lunchtime. Sometimes people have meetings. Other times they come a bit late and they really don't want to miss anything. So we'll upload this to our unlisted YouTube channel and then share with our participants. But I want to start with appreciating your time, David. I know, again, you're super busy. You're going to tell a bit about your story and what you're currently doing. But I
Yeah.
personally know your time is super valuable, and you putting 45 minutes of that time with our program really means a lot. So thank you. And I want to welcome everyone to our session of Lunch and Learn. I'm super excited to have David. He's going to introduce himself, but as you know how this works. I have a couple of questions for David. We're going to explore his knowledge around product, which is immense. And then I'm happy to bring you guys to stage. You can drop questions in the chat. I'll bring you contextually. So David, you don't need to care about the chat. I'll manage that. And I'll bring anyone who has questions in between my own questions. I'll probably ask a couple of follow-ups if it makes sense. The goal is for us to learn as much as possible from you, ideally to kind of be a sounding board of the content I bring to the participants on our Monday sessions. So I don't know what you're going to answer. Hopefully it matches what I teach. If it doesn't, it's an opportunity to learn even more. So it's a win-win anyway. So yeah, that's basically
Sounds great.
it. Awesome. I hope you're excited. So David, let's start with introducing yourself. Tell us a bit about your story, what you're doing now,
Yeah.
and why should we listen to you?
Sounds good. Well, first of all, thanks, Andre, for having me here. Super excited to meet all of you and get the chance to have a bit of a conversation. My name is David. Just a bit of background on me. I'm originally from Oakland, California, which is in San Francisco Bay Area, right across the water from the city. Started my career actually not as a PM, as probably most people in this room do, but as a data analyst. So my background's in stats and economics. And shortly after, one of my first jobs was actually joining Twitter. So I joined around almost 10 years ago and started as a data analyst, first working with ads, and then actually was able to shift over and worked as a product analyst for the consumer product. So analyzing growth, A/B tests, kind of opportunity sizing. And that's really what sparked my interest in diving deeper into the product space. So I was able to make the jump at Twitter. In total, I ended up working there around 6.5, 7 years. The first half being an analyst, product analyst, and then made the jump to product and worked there on iOS, on their web product, and also on international growth and expansion. So a lot of times, and you've probably seen this as a product manager, but a lot of times we're really focused on what we can see in our surroundings and the environment we interact with. And a lot of times in Silicon Valley, that's people with perfect connectivity on an iPhone with lots of good content in the case of Twitter. And less so the focus was on emerging markets where there might be expensive data, poor connections, a lack of quality content. So a lot of my focus was on internationalization, global expansion, and localization there. And yeah, being from the Bay Area, being from California, wanted to change it up a bit and also get more experience on the international level. And so about 3.5 years ago, I moved to Barcelona and started working at Glovo. For those of you who don't know, but you probably do, Glovo is big European, African, and Eastern Europe delivery logistics company. Joined there at an interesting time because they're really starting to create more of a product mentality and product first, user first development rather than prior. It was really driven by operations. It has always been staffed kind of more so with non-technical people and non-product people. So it was an interesting time to see that transition. And yeah, I was there for around 3 years. It was a great learning experience. In particular, got to build some products from scratch, which at Twitter, I never really had the opportunity to do because it was such a mature product with so many users already. It was more so optimizing the existing products and adding new features rather than thinking and doing discovery from the ground level. And having a background in data, it was great because I got to run A/B tests all the time for every feature and be really data driven about the decision making. But obviously, when you're in a smaller, earlier stage of a product, such as it was at Glovo, you're not able to A/B test your way there, right? You really need to rely on more qualitative methods or really go to the ground truth when you're thinking about MVP development. So that's that. I won't go on more about it. For the last 3-4 months or so, I've actually been taking the time to start freelancing and consulting. So I wanted to broaden my experience working with startups and also some bigger companies. And so I've been freelancing as a product consultant, particularly focused on MVP product development with startups and also on A/B testing and experimentation for bigger companies. So actually right now I'm working with a couple startups and also with the LA Times, which is a big paper in the US, to help them become more data-driven around user engagement and experimentation.
Awesome. I mean, I'm pretty sure that background is going to bring a lot of questions, and I'm looking forward for your answers that I'm pretty sure they're going to be built based on that experience. So I'm very curious about that. I generally start these conversations with a belief, and then I'm going to ask whether you think I'm right or wrong, why, and then it kind of segues into the first question. I hope that's okay. So my belief here is simple, and I think your experience on this belief is actually quite relevant, which is most people, when assessing the evolution of a product, they only focus on the things they see. But most of the time, there's an immense amount of things that are happening in the background that only the people working in that product, in that company, know how much work is being put on that and that no one is actually seeing. How do you think this is right or wrong, and that you have to manage the psychology of this? And my first question is around how do you run this type of discovery with things on the background, with not like, oh, there's a customer I'm going to test. I'm saying this also, and I'm bringing this belief to you because with your experience at Twitter, I know a lot of people focus on Twitter and what they see, but I bet there's so much stuff happening inside of Twitter that people don't see, and they're as important, maybe even more. How do you feel about this?
Yeah, I think that's largely correct, right? It's easy to see things from the user perspective from the outside and not understand why things aren't moving faster, why things are changing, or why certain decisions were made. So certainly from the inside, there's levels of complexity that kind of dictate a lot of what you're doing. And also, as you said, kind of make running discovery not as simple as just getting users in the room and talking to them. There's a lot of other factors, especially at bigger companies, that might obfuscate that, right? So, and I think it depends on the context. I don't want to. I mean, a lot of what happened at Twitter, and to extent at Glovo too, had a lot to do with different company goals and pushing and pulling that are kind of beyond the extent of what an individual product manager and team can control. So going back to the question on discovery, though, I think even though you might have lots of other factors, stakeholder management, goals to achieve, let's say big technical goals that you don't even cross your mind from the outside, let's say like a refactor of some core services or something that changes your strategy over the course of weeks or months, it's important to take the small chances you get to do discovery constantly. And so I would say, really, I mean, there's lots of techniques, which I'm sure you're all learning and hearing about, around user discovery, qualitatively from surveys, from generative studies, quantitative insights, market research, all this. But I'd say the most important thing is trying to do it more frequently, even if it's for less amount of time, right? So that could be on the platform itself, listening to customers. And at Twitter, we had a great sounding board for that, because there were millions of tweets every day. And so that was direct feedback on the product. So taking the time to do that more frequent, and even if it's for a less amount of time, and constantly hearing from users. And there's a number of ways you can do this. I mean, you can go on the product and interact with them that way. You can go try and link up with them offline in a more informal setting. My macro point is that it doesn't have to always be formalized, and the more frequently you can do it, the better. So for example, Twitter, I mentioned we were interacting directly on Twitter with them. And at Glovo, I mentioned we started building a product from scratch, which was a vendor portal for the businesses and the merchants. And we were so early stage and wanted to keep the discovery and feedback loop going without saying, okay, here's our plan for the next month, that we wanted that kind of always on cycle. So we actually had our users and some of the merchants in a WhatsApp group, which is not scalable in the long run. But when you're just starting up, I think it was super valuable, because we would get feedback 2 or 3 times a week. And we would quickly realize when something's going down the wrong path, that without that sort of quick loop, we might have discovered a few weeks later. And obviously that's what you're looking to avoid in the early stages of product development. So
yeah, I think
that's,
that example there is, I think it's a really gold nugget, because a lot of people look at these high profile companies like Glovo, unicorn or multiple unicorns, Twitter, massive public company, and they feel like, oh, there's such a formalized, rigid process of how doing discovery. And then you say, look, we had people on WhatsApp, we talked with them, it's better to get it like running than going through a hard process. And it's like, okay, so that means that I can do that. And it's actually simpler than it looks. I have a quick follow-up on this, which is, do you feel like running discovery and learning from this is easier or harder, given that both companies you worked these last 2 experiences were super high profile companies? Do you feel that helped on your discovery process, or that it hindered, it was harder? How do you feel about this?
Probably a yes and no answer, right? Like, as far as recruiting, so let's say on the formal side, it probably helps, right? If you're doing a research study with a user researcher, and you have that all laid out and mapped out, you're probably having a lot more interest, and it helps in recruit. And it's easier to get access to kind of these insights, because there is this interest around it, and it is more high profile, so to speak. On the informal side, kind of the other side of the coin to that is that you're not quite sure whether the answers you're hearing are biased or not because of that high profile. So I guess it cuts both ways on that. I think it can be good just for being able to generate demand and generate interest and giving feedback. But at the same time, really what you want to have is an honest conversation. And the number one thing about user research is not guiding or not biasing the answers in any way. So you want them to be able to tell you your product shit, or this makes 0 sense, or I would do it differently. Those are the gold nuggets you're looking for. So I think
definitely. So how did you, now that we touching on this. How did you manage that bias? Because I'm assuming like at Global, for example, you had massive partners that were driving a lot of business for them through Global. And I bet there were very loud voices. At Twitter, probably have power users who use that extensively, maybe a lot of following. Like, how did you not get caught up in the biases of these power users and were able to build like properly to across the base?
It's a great question. This is, and coming from a background in data, this always strikes me as something that can potentially be problematic with user research and qualitative methods. And I think the answer is blending it with data and with quantitative methods. So user research is really good at getting at the why answers, right? Like you're hearing the motivation for why people like something, why it's useful, why it's problematic. However, you always run the risk of bias. You usually have a pretty small sample size. You don't know what you're hearing is anecdotal or if it's representative of your overall user base. So I think one way to combat that, beyond just having proper research methods that you're thinking about sampling correctly and you're thinking about, is this representative, and you're asking the questions in an unbiased way, is to back it up with broader data. And I think one of the best ways to discovery is actually with data from the start. One of my things has always been, let's not just have data people and analytics come in post development to tell us the results, but it should be earlier on in the process to say, this is where the opportunity lies. So for example, if you're looking at developing a specific feature, it's really useful before going into a qualitative study to do discovery and hearing from users directly to understand what the broader user trends are, understand how many people are using this functionality, in which ways are they using it, which ways are they not using it. And that frames the context. So when you hear someone saying something, you can say like, okay, well, this is opinion, but we know what is actually happening. So the quantitative part is the what, and the people give you the why they're doing it. And so meshing those two together is super pivotal to gain context. And oftentimes you can do it directly. So if you're looking at users, oftentimes you can kind of see like what has their behavior been in the past. And of course, you want to make sure you jump through all the correct privacy loops with that. But like, it's very useful to know the context of what that user has actually done prior when you're selecting them for user research. Are they a power user? Are they new? Are they old? What parts of the product do they use? Because that all puts into context their comments, rather than otherwise you have the threat of creeping in this bias.
All right, makes absolute sense. Agree. I think context sometimes is an area where most PMs lack, because they just drive into interviewing and qualitative answers without actually knowing whether that influences a part of the product, the segment of customers, etc. So I think that makes absolute sense. So you touched on data, like you came from a data background. It seems data as a skill set influenced a lot of your product approach. I want to ask you, what are beyond data, and maybe you can tell me, yeah, data is just a bonus, not actually a core skill, but I doubt you'll say that. But what are some core skills that you believe matter for product managers? Like if you had to point out like 1, 2, 3 things that probably every PM needs to have a good score, and the better you are at those skills, the better you'll be as a product manager. Do you have any examples?
Yeah, and it's a good question. I think, well, in general, as you all know, product manager is a broad skill set. It's a generalist, and you have to be able to be competent in a number of different areas. You have to be able to interface with engineers, obviously, but you have to be able to also bring your product and explain it to the rest of the company, to the customers, kind of wear multiple hats. So there's lots of context switching and being willing to do everything not everything at a high level, but being able to at least transfer info in between different parts of the company and sit in a room and understand different types of conversations is super important. There's kind of a comment around, there's kind of a notion of being a specialist versus a generalist, and having something as a background, which is, I think maybe you've heard of in the past, this sort of T-shaped skill set. I'm not sure where that comes from, but I think that's always useful to think about. So the idea is that you're broad across a number of areas, and then you go deep in one area. I think that's really important because you're able to kind of be a PM that brings some sort of specialty to the table, whether that's design, whether that's engineering and technical understanding, whether that's a business background, or it's, in my case, like a data background. So that's one thing. And I think I'd encourage people to, as you're thinking of being a generalist, also keep trying to develop that skill in that stem of the T area. But honestly, kind of on the day-to-day, it can be different skill sets. And a few things jump out to mind is like, maybe not what you learn in the books, but something that is going to be super useful being, especially with a big team and at a bigger company, if that's the case, is just the ability to, and one of my first bosses at Twitter told me this, there's so much information and there's so much direction any product can go. And you as the PM are going to be in a room with tons of different people with different skill sets, different understandings. And he had a good analogy, which is kind of imagine a sine curve of where the y-axis is level of complexity or amount of information. And your job at the PM is to, on the upswing of that, help ask the questions, bring in data, bring in the opinions of stakeholders, bring in, like, increase the amount of information and knowledge that you're having on a certain topic. However, it's also your job to distill that on the downside of the curve and throw things out, understand what's important or not, try and really simplify the problem space, because I think oftentimes everyone is contributing their specific role, a data analyst, the user researcher, business side. No one's thinking of it all together. And so you're responsible for bringing all the information in, building it up, and then also synthesizing and saying, well, of everything we learned, here's the 20% that's the most essential going forward, and communicating that out to everyone. So that's always been, that analogy I've always really liked, as maybe it doesn't come up that often and like kind of the exact textbook skills that product managers need to have, but there's nothing more essential than that, because then it's information overload, confusion, and lack of direction. So I've always found that a good practical thing to follow.
I think it makes sense. That gave me like 2 follow-up questions to that answer. I'll probably ask the second. I have another one, but it's more about your background with this. But you touched on something that I find super core to the best. It correlates with the best product managers, which is your ability to ask great questions. More than give the best ideas or to suggest specific paths, etc., is really focus on asking questions and ideally ask great questions. So based on your answer, it seems you agree with this. My question here is more like, how do you get better at asking better questions? I don't know if this is something that you have an answer for, but I bet you think about this, because asking questions matters.
Yeah, and it's a good question about questions. I think it comes with, well, first of all, is doing a bit of your homework, and going into when you're meeting with people in different areas, kind of understanding what they're working on, what their goals are on, putting yourself in their shoes and asking the questions as if you were doing that job. So, and then when you get all in a room and you're hearing things, you have the prior context and you're able to, having a bit of the context already, it really helps you synthesize and try and call out the important questions. I'm not sure what other techniques you, Andre, might have in this, but for sure 100% agree that it's more about raising the issues and trying to ask the tough questions that maybe people are overlooking or wouldn't ask if they don't have perspectives from other sides. So I guess like putting this together, I think one thing that allows you to ask good questions is knowing the perspective from various sides, right? So you're able to challenge or ask questions that people might see without having the background from different perspectives.
Yeah, I agree. And something you said really resonated, which is you're dealing with all these people who are in specific functions, whether it's engineering, design, research, data, etc. And oftentimes their perspective is limited to either what they work on or their skill sets. And oftentimes they don't have the 360 perspective, and that divergent or like gathering everyone's input and asking the right questions for them to give you great answers, but then converging, synthesizing those insights and often communicating those insights to everyone really matters, right?
Well, yeah, one more point of this, and going back to the sine curve analogy, I think when you're distilling the information and you're communicating it out, it's important to keep in mind the audience, and that might be different for different sides. So to your point around when you're in the launch process of a product or a feature, oftentimes you're having back-to-back meetings, one with the engineering team trying to debug something, very technical, low-level discussions, other with a comms marketing business team trying to explain to them how it's going to launch, how it's going to work, etc. And you're basically trying to put the two sides together, but with different filters of like, how much information am I giving to the engineers about the comms problems, and how much on the comms side am I giving about the bugs that we're finding and when they're going to be solved, etc. So like the context is super key there. Otherwise, it's not going to be useful for them.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like oftentimes part of my job is like, it's making people understand that they don't see everything that is happening on the other side, but at the same time, like managing my frustration to not just dump on top of those people all the problems that they don't see, because they don't actually need to deal with that. I think being that filter is a really tough job, and it becomes frustrating, especially when you get attacked and you got to you can't defend yourself because that's your job. But I think it's a tough thing to manage, in my opinion. So my second follow-up was, you mentioned like the T-shaped and the specific thing, or a bunch of things that you are more of a specialist. And I usually say, I don't know if this is what happened to you, but I usually say that most people end up in product accidentally, in a certain sense. They fall into the role because they were doing something that was orbiting it. And someone in the product org said this person and their specific skill set would be a very good addition to the team. Was this what happened to you because you went from data to product at Twitter? It seems that was your gateway into product management.
No.
It was different? Okay, tell the story.
Well, I mean, actually, ever since I was in university, I was in the Bay Area, and ever since I kind of discovered that product existed, I got lucky and got an internship on a business team at Google. And there I was thinking, okay, I like stats and data. If I was smart enough, I would go the computer science route, but I can't pull this off. Oh, wow, there's this thing called product management where you can kind of work with technical people and build features, but you're not directly in the coding world. So I knew that existed. I found that out when I was in university. I was like, that's perfect. How do I get there? And at the time, there wasn't really introductory programs, which are now kind of associate product manager roles, which oftentimes they're looking for people fresh out of college because everyone is coming from a side, right? Or traditionally that's how it's happened in product. They were just starting out. I think Google had one. I think they rejected me. So I knew that there was, I knew this existed, and I knew that I wanted to try it out. And I was kind of trying to triangulate on what's the stepping stone to get there. And I think someone had once told me that, there's a few tracks that you can come into, and that will become your T as a product manager. And traditionally it had been engineers. Like that had been a hard and fast rule almost for hiring at Google for product. But I think people realize over time that doesn't make sense. You're cutting off a lot of good, talented people that are coming and bringing other perspectives. And so then I kind of went down the data and analytics road as a way into that. But always kind of had it in the back of my mind of hopefully this would lead to product down the line.
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm gonna say you're lucky because you got that light early on. Most people are like, I never knew this was a reality, and now it's like, how do I get in? Because this looks like really cool. So I'm glad you got that data or that intel early on. The product world's lucky that happened. So I mean, it's not often that we get to speak with someone who's been experiencing unicorns, super large companies, whether public or private, and you're one of them. And a question I like to ask whenever I have the chance is, what are some important things that people should understand that matter for PMs at this type or this size type of companies? Like things that probably people are not realizing it matters. Like, is there a couple of things that are important for PMs at unicorn state?
Unicorn state.
Yeah, it is. That's what they are.
It's a good question. I think, well, I'm not sure about exactly what it takes to get to unicorn state. I don't know if there's a magic formula there, but definitely there's some things I've noticed when you found your product market fit and you're on kind of the growth trajectory, and there's things that can really hinder that. make it much more difficult for you, or enable that and continue it and further it? One thing that stuck out at Twitter and also at Glovo really is around fragmentation and specializing your product and the number of use cases. And I think it in particular pertains to international growth. So it can probably be relevant in other areas too, but it becomes really obvious when you're growing internationally or wherever you're growing across a segmented audience. And what do I mean by that is like different types of users, either geographically or very different use cases, different types of customers. There's this it's kind of this intuition to say like, okay, well, if we have different types of customers, different markets, let's go forward in all of them at once, because that's the way to maximize growth. And we're going to expand internationally. And I think that's true. It's one thing that really happened at Twitter, but you also run the risk of forking or fragmenting your product by doing 25 different things. And then all of a sudden nothing works because there's mounds and mounds of tech debt. And when you're launching a feature, you need to account for every single use case that you had devised in the past. So one example of this at Twitter was Japan. They had really good product market fit there based on anonymity, the brevity of the form. Like Japanese text is very short form and Twitter is short form. It took off so well there in such a big market that they said, okay, let's actually build a product and engineering team for Twitter Japan. And this didn't work, to say the least. What happened was you end up forking and specializing just for Japan, and then you're kind of losing the insights. And if you're doing something for one side, you have to rebuild it 5 times because the logic might be different for Japan, might be different for India, might be different for Brazil. And so it's really going to slam the brakes on your growth because you're bringing in all these self-imposed barriers because the logic is forked and different. It also happened a lot at Glovo, to be honest. They grew. So not only kind of one of the challenges at Glovo is it's Europe based, yes, but in order to not compete with the giants in Western Europe, they kind of expanded on a track of international expansion in Africa, South America, Eastern Europe, Central Asia. Obviously, those are very, very different markets, and building a unique use case in each one to accommodate for a merchant or a user, what have you, is great because it unlocks more users and more target audience. But at the same time, that sort of fragmentation, you might have something that works really well in country X, and it's the only way you can keep country X around. However, that's only 3 or 4% of your total user base. So every time you're delivering a feature, you're spending hours and hours and hours trying to get it to work in country X. And overall, that's slowing down the growth you could have globally. So it's kind of it's a balance. I just say keep in mind like localization versus fragmentation is key. And again, this is a pretty specific problem to once you get at a bigger scale. So probably doesn't apply in the early stages, but that's something that I've definitely battled with a lot at Twitter and then also at Glovo. Maybe you've seen that too, Andre.
Yeah, I definitely saw that. And I love this type of answer because this is the type of thing that most people really don't understand. What looks like building product and making decisions at a certain scale. Like I said, I think most people focus on what they see and they don't realize that this type of decision making from an org perspective, from a trade-off perspective, etc., really impact how things are built and all the things. And I don't even know how to explain. It's like they're details. It's a machine, and if you don't care about specific details, the machine breaks. It's not just the core things that you actually see. So I love that type of answer. Sorry, my video got cut off. I think that's exactly what I was looking for. So I generally do like a small break. Yeah, sorry, you're gonna say. No, okay. So I generally do a small break question because I always love to ask I call it the crazy story question. Okay. Which is people like you that came from such large companies, such high profile companies. I bet inside there's like one story that kind of marked you, it made you remember it. It was, I'm not gonna say pivotal, but it was at least something that you went through. Is there anything?
I didn't get fired by Elon Musk on Twitter, so
you don't have that story.
Yeah, maybe if I was there in the last couple of months, it would have changed things significantly. But
yeah, you could have collected a couple badges if you were there for the last couple of months. By the way, and this is for participants. I'm not going to ask questions about what's going on Twitter right now to David. It's up to him to show whatever he thinks. That would be a very eye candy thing. I'm focused more on the product process there.
Yeah.
But David, you're free to share whatever you want, of course.
Yeah.
But yeah, crazy stories from your experience that you went through that. Is there one thing that's like,
I can think of a couple, and I'll give you one from Twitter, but it wasn't necessarily pertaining to the madness there at the moment. I would say it was more of just something that comes with the scale, and something that makes you realize everything is magnified, everything is amplified. And I mentioned this earlier about Twitter, you're getting that direct feedback within seconds. So as we would do rollouts, we would crank up the percentage of, we'd do an A/B test, then we'd start to crank up the percentage like 10, 15, 20, 50, 100. And we'd see in real time people talking about it, majority negative usually, even if the A/B test was great. Just confusion, commentary, criticism, some people saying they liked it, but it's very instantaneous feedback cycle and lots of usage, right? So one good anecdote, which was kind of a fuck up, but a funny one, was I was on the iOS team and we were doing a big fundamental change to change the primary action button, which is normally a tweet. I could send new tweet. Before this, it was up in the top right in the header. And we moved it to being a floating action button, which is very, very common pattern on a lot of apps. But it's actually comes from Android, and we were implementing on iOS. So we were trying to get to work in something that's simple, very, in theory, simple. The pattern exists, tons of minute details, and we were actually running, I think, a 4-bucket A/B test. We were testing within the center, which I think is how Instagram was doing at the time, embedded in the nav in the center, a fab, which is the floating action, like I told you, versus the top. And there might have been one other variant. It's great. Kick off the test. I think it's Friday. I go home. I think I'm like out to dinner at something. And an engineer texts me saying, it's like 9 p.m. An engineer texts me saying he's on Twitter and he's seeing people complain about there being no button to tweet at all. And I'm like, well, that's not good. And even though I think it was a 1% test, but each bucket was around 250,000 to 300,000 users. So you end up getting real quick feedback. And he's like, I'm looking into this. And about an hour later, he said, okay, I can recreate it. And it's basically you went to one tab, you went back, and something was overlaid, so the buttons disappeared. And I'm searching on Twitter and I'm seeing people saying, tweet button's gone, Twitter doesn't want you to tweet anymore. Because of course people don't know this is an experiment. They're seeing it on their side. They think it's gone forever. And so that was a fun weekend. Because it was part of an experiment, we couldn't just turn it off, because then everyone that we had moved just the day prior, the experience had changed for them. The button would flip back to where it was before, and that would affect 1 million people because it was around a 1% test. So we had a problem with 0.25%. However, we needed to devise a way with the engineering team and the experimentation team to just deactivate that group. Otherwise, we were going to affect and flip around 1 million people's tweet buttons. So I think we eventually got it done, and we had to restart the test because it was all biased after that. But it just goes to show, even though you're testing with 0.25% of the user base, you're getting a lot of commentary and a lot of feedback. And if you take away the primary purpose of Twitter, so 250,000 people can't tweet, even if it's just for a day or so, it can be a bit stressful. But looking back on it, it was pretty entertaining. I didn't get fired.
Yeah, I feel like the common end of an answer to this question is always a variation of looking back, it was pretty interesting. But I bet that weekend you thought twice about experimenting stuff.
It makes you really think about understanding how the experiment will work, having a backup plan of how you turn it off, understanding each user's experience, and just being careful more than anything.
Yeah.
Especially at that size. Yeah.
I love these stories because when you work at startups, you end up dealing with founders and executive teams. And in the startup world, they're always very pushy, we got to go, we got to be fast. And oftentimes you even inherit that. Like I'm a very speed oriented type of person. But then like that thoughtfulness and the being careful and putting kind of yourself in your user shoes and what will happen if you make a too rushed decision. I think it's the type of example that I love to bring to people in these positions that they need to care about. And I bet in that case, and I think this is a perfect like kind of follow-up answer to the what type of things at unicorn stage you got to care. Because I mean, if you got there, probably you have a pretty large user base or customer base. And every single action will actually have a ripple effect that people will look, they'll notice, right?
And of course, this is, I mean, the whole point of this is that you are able to de-risk what you're doing because you're doing a test on 0.25%. Right. But like keeping in mind 0.25% is still
there's a lot of people,
but there, it just kind of makes you think, especially with what's going on recently and the changes there, of a lot of these, you know, we're cutting out the unnecessary red tape is what Alon's saying, and like the implementation of the verification and Twitter Blue and all this, but a lot of that exists for a reason. And I think we've seen some consequences of that. Of course, like you can always be lean and nimble, and that's the point, which is also what's great about smaller companies and startups, but there's a lot of reason these sort of checks and balances are in place.
Yeah, I agree.
On stuff when it comes to privacy and other things, right? Like we should be embarrassed by your first product, but let's not get sued over
it. That's actually a great addition to, you should feel embarrassed about your first product. There's like the move fast and break things with stable infra, the evolution of it. It's kind of the pre-definition of an MVP at the public company. I think that's a great story. By the way, curiosity, have you ever read the book Hatching Twitter? They were there for so long that I don't know if you read it. I think that's
the Nick Bilton one.
Exactly, that one. I think it's I don't know if you agree, because you have always a different perspective. I loved reading that. I felt that was a complete TV show worthy kind of book. I hope they do something with that, because now like what's happening, you have like second part of the book, and I think it's again TV show worthy. So but I bet like being inside, it's always
that was a bit before my time. I think that was kind of like early 2000s.
That was early.
I joined in 2013, so I think the company was like 7 or 8 years old at that point.
Yeah, no, I bet. So we only have kind of like 5 minutes or 6, so I'll ask one question and a final question that I always ask my guests. But the kind of the final question is, I had 2 options. I'm going to choose one. The one I'm going to choose is like relationships, because I think relationships are core, and you come from 2 very large companies where there's a lot of people, large teams, probably there's a lot of stakeholders, and even decisions maybe are very complex because they affect a lot of different areas and orgs. So my question to you is, what type of advice do you give to people who want to optimize the relationship they have with stakeholders, people you work with? Is there like a 1-2 thing that made a big difference for you creating strong relationships?
Well, in general, I think kind of the obvious answer, but shouldn't be overlooked, is listening to them and understanding their job from the very, very start, understanding what's driving them, what they're looking to accomplish, what concerns them. That's like step 0. If you're not showing, it's partly, obviously it's to understand where they're coming from, their perspective. It's also to show that you care about that. So you're gaining a bit of trust. You're actually looking to understand what challenges them, what they're trying to do, rather than say like, tell me, but really all I'm focused on is getting my own thing done. So that shouldn't be overlooked. Bring them in from the start and having them as a part of earlier ideation and sort of helping them contribute, as make them feel a part of the solution, is key. And I think like you're going to be, that's great to say, but then what you don't want that to turn into is having them be approvers and have the whole process being done by committee, right? So like if you have a model of I guess there's that model DASI with decision approver and contributor informed. You want to make sure they're contributing and informed, but never get blocked on it. But a simpler and maybe less by the books answer is be interested in them and hang out with them. have non-work conversations in particular with stakeholders is even more pivotal than people on your team. Because if you like, okay, a product person is talking to a business person, there's automatically this tension assumed that one party's gonna want one thing, one party's gonna want the other thing, and all your conversations might be framed by that. So whenever you can have a chance where there's none of that pressure to talk about whatever it is, I think is huge. And it's simple, but I think it works well.
I think it's so simple that it's really important to mention. I feel like the simpler stuff are the ones people assume everyone knows, and that type of common sense is actually rarer than it looks. So I think it's actually a great point. Like, it's all about building some level of trust, and oftentimes I don't know if you feel about this, kind of a digression, but I feel like remote makes us a lot more transactional and a lot more like you jump on a Zoom because of this, and creating that sense is much harder. Do you agree? Or
yeah,
how did you find this?
I totally agree, just because it feels a bit more forced to, okay, now we're doing our small talk at the park because we're supposed to do this, you know. And now we're jumping into the topic. There's not this like intermittent time when you're walking to the conference room, when you're going to get a coffee, these sorts of things. So it's tough. I still think it's important to try and find that time though. But yeah, remote's tougher.
Yeah, I agree. So last question before we wrap up, which is the one question I always ask by the end to all my guests, which is, imagine you could speak with your younger self, young David, starting tomorrow in his first product role, and you could say one thing to him, one advice, even if he wouldn't listen to you, what would that one thing be, given the power of hindsight?
Yeah, this might be a cop-out answer, but I might go back to what I said earlier about the generalist and specialist. I think nailing, trying to figure out how to work in different areas, execution wise, opportunity sizing, discovery. How do I improve myself technically? How do I speak design language? This is all important. You should try and do that and become good at operating, but keep in mind that you're going to try to also contribute something a bit different, a bit of your secret sauce that maybe makes you stand out a bit, and where you can, I think it's always trying to bring value, especially to your engineers, in a way that that speaks to your experiences and where you came from. So I don't think, I guess the answer would be, you should do your research and try and learn and better yourself in a broad area that we call PM skills, but don't throw out the door what you did previously and how that relates and why that got you into product. So I'm sure pretty much everyone has a reason of how they discovered in their current day-to-day or through their passions, like how this could relate to product. Don't get rid of that. Keep working on that and keep trying to bring that. Yeah, I think that's really valuable, and maybe I didn't recognize that at the start.
Makes sense. Would you listen to yourself if you look back? I love how all the variations of that answer is always like, not to, I hope I would. Well, we'll see, but I hope everyone listens to that. But I always love asking this question because I always get very different answers to it. So I think that was perfect. And David, we're exactly spot on time as promised. I hope you enjoyed. This was great.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, hearing your answers, that was awesome. Like, we don't get the opportunity of talking with people who've been at so impactful, like world-changing companies as you did. I'm looking forward to see your future challenges, whether it's going product consulting and helping a lot of other companies in the product world, or actually joining another company. I'm rooting for you. I'm going to be following, going to be talking more. This was a great time. Really appreciate your answers and availability. I hope everyone enjoyed. I personally did, and got to learn more, and I hope you did as well.
No problem. Happy to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Awesome, David. Appreciate. Thank you, everyone who joined. Have a great end of week. We'll share the recording soon. This was great. See you on Monday. And David, have an awesome weekend. Enjoy Barcelona. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.